Welcome everyone. Today we're diving deep into Space Marine 2, the long-anticipated sequel to one of the best Warhammer 40k games. After spending over 150 hours in the game, I'm ready to share my thoughts, so let's get started. Let's kick things off with the campaign. Space Marine 2 picks up 200 years after the events of the first game. We step back into the armored boots of Demetrius Titus. After being sent to the Death Watch to atone for his actions in the first game, Titus is back. Titus is brought back into the Ultramarines by Lord Calgar and demoted from captain to lieutenant. The game wastes no time throwing you into battle, a leader of a squad where once again Titus proves he is the leader we all deserved. The campaign is a mostly self-contained story, which I appreciate. You don't have to be a Warhammer lore expert to enjoy it, though there are plenty of nods to the first game and the wider Warhammer universe, and so at minimum, I would suggest reading up on the events of the first game. Knowing the premise and conclusion of the first game can enhance your experience, but 80% of the story in Space Marine 2 is self-contained. This balance means newcomers can dive in without feeling lost, while fans of the first game will appreciate the references to past events. The story covers a solid variety of environments and missions taking place across 3 planets. You'll battle through war-torn cities, swamps, jungles, and factories, each offering its own atmosphere and challenges. While all the settings are well executed, I personally prefer the war-torn cities as they truly captured the feel of a large-scale conflict. This is not an open-world game. Each mission is completed within a linear map with clear objectives. There's no exploration for the sake of it, and the only collectibles I found were voice recordings that provided insight into the next phase of the story. Occasionally, unique weapons were placed strategically for upcoming battles. The game has a well-defined path that keeps you in the action from start to finish, which I didn't always follow. While my detours didn't hurt the experience, I believe sticking to the main path is how the game is meant to be played. Between missions, you're transported to a central hub, the command barge, where debriefings occur and you can choose your loadout for the next mission. In co-op and PvP modes, you can also customize your Space Marine, selecting the branch that determines your Marine's colors and decals. As for the story itself, it is average at best, with the peppering of suspense. What really keeps you invested are the players on hand and how they all get along. Most notably is Titus and his new squad. The way he gets the squad kinda ignites the tension with them, and that leads to other subplots that are eventually realized by the game's end. In fact, as far as character development is concerned, all 3 squad members have their moments, with one of them standing out. Considering the campaign's relatively concise nature, this is a solid accomplishment in storytelling. It's a bromance movie in the Warhammer universe. No one can say no to that. Now, the real heart of Space Marine 2 is the combat, and here it delivers in spades. This game feels like a love letter to the action games of old. It's fast-paced, brutal, and doesn't hold your hand. I played solo on Veteran, which was a bit of a slog at first, but I really just had to get good, and once you hit that rhythm, the gameplay experience was everything I'd hoped for. The combat cycle revolves around the balance of ranged and melee attacks. You'll often be thinning out enemies with your rifle before charging in with your chainsword or power hammer for up-close and personal combat. You can't help but feel the weight of your armor as you move. Everything feels heavy and purposeful. Titus moves like a tank, and his weapons hit hard, which is exactly what you want from a Space Marine game. There's a real sense of satisfaction when you chain together ranged attacks, dodges, and brutal melee finishes. Plus, blocking and countering enemy strikes lets you replenish your armor and health, which keeps the combat tense and rewarding. This game is something special. I wouldn't compare it to anything else. Just like Devil May Cry when it first arrived on the scene, Space Marine 2 feels like its own entity. On the surface, you're just running around with guns and melee weapons, but the variety and depth make it so much more. You have a range of melee options including combat knives, power swords, warhammers, and the iconic chainsword. You can practically feel the grind of the chainsword as you slice through hordes of enemies. Ranged weapons include rifles, pistols, and snipers, and the iconic plasma and melter-based weapons. Combat is a fluid cycle of whittling down enemies with ranged attacks before closing in for brutal melee kills. The game does a fantastic job of showing how bulky and powerful Space Marines are, from their slow, heavy movements to their devastating attacks. The enemy hierarchy includes minor enemies that come in hordes, masses of adds that should not be taken too lightly, While some can be dispatched with a single shot, they can still do enough damage, making you vulnerable to the tougher enemy types like the Majorist level or Extremis level enemies. Extremis enemies have a larger health pool and offer a more aggressive playstyle, with each possessing unique abilities like invisibility or a missile volley. Often as well, bosses show up with massive health pools that can do large AoE damage. Fighting these bosses is where teamwork can really save your bacon. Beyond the campaign, Space Marine 2 offers a robust multiplayer experience, split between campaign co-op, PvP and operations. Co-op allows you to team up with 2 other players as your squad battles through the campaign's missions. It's the same experience as solo play, but cranking up the difficulty and coordinating with your team makes it a more intense experience. Then there's operations, a more fleshed out co-op mode where you tackle side missions in teams of 3 where you can take on 6 different operations that have direct influences on the main campaign. You can choose from 6 different types of Space Marines, each with their own unique distinct playstyle, abilities and weapons. For example, the Bulwark Marine wields a shield and a pistol for perfect tanking and drawing enemy fire. Meanwhile, the Vanguard has a grapple hook that lets you dive kick enemies for a satisfying close quarters kill. There is a fully developed skill and perk system for both you and your weapons. Perks range from increasing ammo capacity to enhancing headshot damage. Armor perks can improve damage output during finishes or increase resistances after defeating major enemies. Melee weapons also vary in parry windows, from narrow windows for block weapons to more forgiving windows for fencing weapons. You unlock these perks by grinding XP or finding tier-specific armory data in each map, with higher tiers unlocked based on difficulty. The variety in Space Marine classes adds a lot of replay value. Each mission feels different depending on the team composition, and there's a good balance between long-range specialities and melee brawlers. My personal favorite was the Vanguard, but after maxing the Bulwark and the Heavy, it is now a toss-up between those 2. Each class has its own appeal depending on your preferred style and itch on that day. Operations are challenging, especially on higher difficulties, and that's where teamwork becomes critical. Playing solo with bots is an option, but there's no replacement for a well-coordinated team of human players. For instance, the Bulwark acts as a de facto tank, drawing in enemies with these melee-focused gameplay and health replenishing abilities. Couple that with the Sniper or Heavy that acts as ranged DPS focusing on the Majorist level enemies, and the all-rounder Tactical that can add debuffs to enemies while playing both melee and ranged attacker. I personally have not tried PvP, but from what I can tell, it seems to be a riot. I played Space Marine 2 on PC with a 3070 RTX and AMD Ryzen 5600X, pushing everything to max and settings at 1440p. The game ran smoothly for the most part. I did encounter some micro stutters during the most intense combat sections, but nothing that significantly impacted the experience. Frame rates held steady even when the action ramped up. After the first patch, I would say they ironed out the issues that did have a large negative impact on the overall experience. The devs have pushed through a number of subsequent patches that have addressed some of these issues and added in balance changes to weapons and abilities. One thing to note, if you're not running an SSD or better yet an NVMe, load times between missions can get pretty lengthy. A few friends I played with reported long load times on their setups, so that's something to keep in mind if you're considering the PC version. The game's environments are detailed and varied, but it's the combat animations and enemy designs that really stand out. Often you'll get hoarded by a large number of enemies, which not so long ago was not something you would normally see in a third-person action game with this level of detail and fidelity. The game handles it well enough, with minimal frame rate drops on my system at least. There are also moments where you break cover and canopies and you can see far into the distance. Granted, the enemy movements in the background do appear artificial, but more often than not the scope and scale the game is trying to convey is pretty convincing. As much as I enjoyed Space Marine 2, there are a few areas where it could improve. The multiplayer matchmaking can be slow at times, especially when trying to find players for operations. It's not uncommon to wait several minutes to join a game, which can break the flow if you're just trying to jump in for a quick session. Ping issues are another downside. I found myself dealing with high ping in multiplayer, especially when playing with friends from different regions. It's a small gripe, but it becomes noticeable when you're trying to execute precise maneuvers in combat. Another missed opportunity is the fact that you cannot replay the campaign with your custom Space Marine from Operations. It would have been great to go through the story missions again with your multiplayer loadouts, even if that meant cutting out some of the cutscenes. In the end, Space Marine 2 excels in what it sets out to do, deliver intense, action-packed combat in the Warhammer 40k universe. The campaign is short but satisfying, and the multiplayer has enough variety to keep you coming back for more, especially if you enjoy the co-op experience. While it's not without its flaws, particularly in matchmaking and technical issues, those moments are easily overshadowed by the sheer fun of playing as a hulking Space Marine with a chainsword in hand. I put in over 150 hours into the game at this point, and honestly, the core mechanics are just so satisfying that I keep finding reasons to come back. If you're a fan of Warhammer 40k or just looking for a solid action game with deep combat mechanics, Space Marine 2 is definitely worth your time. It's the kind of game that could easily evolve with more updates, more Space Marines, and additional missions down the line. That's it for my review. Thanks for sticking it out. If you play Space Marine 2, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, Titus out.